The call to the member for Indi.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Colleagues, it gives me pleasure to speak to this bill and also to give a notice that I will be supporting the amendment from the member for Mayo. This entitlement issue is one of great concern in my community, and I'm absolutely delighted that the government has brought on this particular bill to establish the authority. But overarchingly, I want to say, government, you haven't gone far enough. There's a lot more that needs to be done. And in setting the scene for what more needs to be done, I'd like to just go back in history a little bit and talk about the MP for Calare, Peter Andren, when he was the independent in this House, and what a magnificent job he did as an independent to take up the battle on behalf of independents at that stage for much, much, much closer scrutiny of what was being given out to members of parliament under that title of entitlement. So to Peter Andren, who has since passed, but one of those very, very wonderful early MPs, I just want to acknowledge your work, Peter, and say, up here in the crossbench with flying the flag, with real passion, because we know there's a long way to go before this particular unpleasant part of how parliament works is addressed. So up here in the crossbench we acknowledge this legislation. We're going to basically vote for it, but we're going to move amendments to make it better. And in moving those amendments, we're going to sort of pick up some of the work that us here in the crossbench have already done a lot of work on. So the member for Denison last year moved a very strong motion, and he absolutely, I think, called on the government to commit to meaningful reform of the entitlements bill. That was back in October, and I totally support his work there. And since then, again, the member for Denison has taken the lead with this, and he's going to be introducing a private member's motion to an Act of Parliament to actually do some work on this, to audit all members' and senators' travel claims, doing this in the previous parliament, for all of us to list substantive activity taken as part of official travel. So, and then to actually make sure that we do the work to clean up the past, but in the process we move forward to making the future better. And in making the future better, there's no shortage of advice to the government. I have to say, when you do the research for this particular bit of legislation, you can see that there's numerous reports that the government have commissioned, but we still haven't gone far enough. So what sort of reports? In 2015, the ANAO report. In 2011, the review of administration of parliamentary entitlement. In 2010, a report as well. So we've got a lot of background telling us what to do. But today I'd just like to concentrate on the latest report, an independent parliamentary entitlement system review, February 2016. And in it, just a classic quote from these really wise people who did the review, and I'd like to read it into Parliament because to those, I know there are many of them in my electorate who are watching this broadcast. I'd just like to say that here's the quote. Broadly speaking, and it's page 2, section 6. So this is the government's report that was brought in February 2016. And it goes, broadly speaking, these reviews concluded that the system, having evolved in a piecemeal and without adequate rationalisation, is complex, confusing, incomplete, contradictory and immensely difficult to follow and administer. And the problem has worsened as demands on and external security of parliamentarians has increased. And it goes on, the complexity of the system's rules and regulations imposes stress on parliamentarians and their staff and on those who administer the system. Parliamentarians can too easily run foul of the rule interpretation or eligibility requirements, and this has undermined public confidence not only in parliamentarians but also in the system itself. So that's true, and that's why it's really good to see that the government's taking some action. So we agree. But then this review goes on and makes some very, very practical recommendations, and I'd like to take a few minutes of the Parliament's time to read again into Hansard. This is the major recommendation, and I so fully support it. The new system should ensure that the relationship between the public and their representatives is one of trust and mutual support. It should be understood by all, simple to use and administer. It should ensure expenses are appropriate, sufficient and fair, be in accordance with reasonable standards and the overarching principle of value for money. And Section 12, we believe the best way to achieve this goal is a principle-based system allowing the parliamentarian flexibility to apply judgment, choice and personal responsibility when using it, but obliging them to report publicly and be subject to reasonable standards of auditing so as to provide transparency and public accountability. So what wisdom? But how to do that? And here's, I think, where I'm really calling on the government to go the next step. This report says, to provide clarity, the rules should, to the extent possible, be consolidated into one single Act of Parliament. One single Act of Parliament. So we end the piecemeal, complex, confusing, incomplete, contradictory and immensely difficult to follow and administer system, and we replace it with an Act of Parliament. Now, colleagues, we haven't quite got there yet. We've got an authority being set up, which is this particular legislation, which I support, and we've got some changes made to how we administer it. But I'm really calling on the Prime Minister and the government to do what his own report says and give us an Act of Parliament. That's principle-based, systemic, easy to read and well followed. So, in bringing my comments just to a close, I want to just talk a little bit about trust and trust in the system. And to do this, I want to just bring to the notice of the Parliament a report that has been prepared by the Museum of Australian Democracy called "Who Do You Trust to Run the Country? Democracy, Trust and Politics in Australia." And I acknowledge the authors of that report, the University of Canberra and the institutions, Museum of Australian Democracy, University of Canberra and the Institute for Government and Policy Analysis. And it tells us what we've been talking about today in this parliament in the previous instance, that Australians no longer trust their politicians. What an extraordinary thing to stand in this House and to have to say, that the research of these highly respected institutions tell us that our population no longer trust us. Our population no longer trust us. And what we just saw a few minutes ago in this House was an effort by us crossbenchers, 4 of us, to say we can do something to help restore trust and faith in our democracy. And we saw this thing happen in this parliament, 4 lonely voices, as I think The Guardian said, against the might of all the political parties. So I think I'm going to say to the people of Australia, it's not that you can't trust parliamentarians. I think you need to pay particular attention to that last vote, because there's clearly some people in this House that you can trust. There are some people, and I dare to say that in the 2016 election, the research shows us that about a quarter of Australians gave their first preference vote to non-mainstream parties, that the people of Australia are actually getting that the parties are not doing a good job representing us, that in fact it's the crossbenchers and the minor parties that have really got this sense of close relationship with our communities, a commitment to represent them, and a great ability to stand up in this House, to think for ourselves and to be able to represent what our communities are saying. And I think what makes it so special about our independence, if I could say, is that the people of Indi know that I'm speaking forcefully and boldly and strongly directly for them. This opinion hasn't gone through any party machine. I'm not putting it through any personal ambition to be a minister. I'm not doing deals to make this happen. I'm absolutely here speaking for my community, as I know my colleagues on the crossbench are. And this sense that we haven't actually got the trust of our community. So I say to my colleagues in the major parties, get a copy of this report and have a read of it. And really and seriously pay some attention to what do we need to do, what do the parties need to do to follow the leadership being provided by the independents on this entitlements bill. And what I really think we need to do, it would make such a big difference if we could actually do the work that needs to be done to have one Act of Parliament. And bringing my comments to a close and to speak in strong support of the amendment that's going to follow from the member for Mayo, having the community voice on this authority is one small step to get that the pub test, if you want, the ordinary Australian person who we represent, getting their voice heard on this authority. So thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'll bring my remarks to a close at this point and speak later when this amendment is introduced.